Hi, this is Michelle Best. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So, and my shameless effort, because the World Series is being played right now, I have given us a kid in a Nationals t-shirt. This child is my son. He was diagnosed at this point about 9 months, and he was 4 years old. But what I wanted to talk to you guys about first is, as you can see, our kids are more than just patients. They need to be able to access their lives, which can be family gatherings, friendships. They'll be attending places of worship, going to school, enjoying activities, sometimes like little soccer teams, or big kids trying to run track. They've got after-school classes or little music classes. They're attending events, vacations. I mean, life is full. It is more than just going to the doctor and getting infusions and meds, and we need to make sure that our kids can access more. The first thing I always recommend people do is to educate yourself. Probably the best resource out there, hands down, is this What is Cure JM, this little flyer that's put out. It's excellent. If you really want to know a lot, I highly recommend this Myositis and You book. You can download that onto your Kindle. Okay, so let's start piecing this apart. When you start looking at trying to access your life, access school, access community, you have to figure out what is getting in the way of that. And so really for JM, it's a combination of your systems and the treatments that you're on. So our kids often, and this is by no means complete, but our kids often have sun sensitivity, muscle weakness, fatigue, a lot of mood issues, headaches, nausea, swallowing issues, calcinosis, pain. They're immunosuppressed. They have some gastrointestinal challenges, and they spend a lot of their life at appointments, infusions, and getting tests done. So let's break this down into how it affects their ability to access life. For example, sun sensitivity. The kids have to decide if they're in school, if they're going to go outside for recess. If they go out and it's fully sunny and they're unable to get some sort of sun protection, their rash may hurt in the moment, and later that rash may then worsen, and much later the JM may flare. So our kids are in a position where they really need to think about, what am I doing and how is it going to affect me down the line? And you need to go back and repeat this with every one of these that impacts your kid, your child. And many of our kids have things that are completely different. They may have other diagnoses, such as, if we're talking school, such as ADHD. There's all kinds of things that impact the way our kids are able to access their community. So again, some of the big things is our kids get left out of sports a lot because it's much harder with the pain and the muscle weakness. And even at school, a lot of these medications make it really hard to concentrate. They make you really tired. So we're going to keep going down the hard path before we start looking at the answers. When you're starting to look at how to access school or activities or your community, you really need to go through this at a step-by-step. And it's very painful, but you need to go through it step-by-step. For example, let's say we'll take school because that's always the most obvious. What time does school start? How are you getting to school? Where is school? Is school, do you live someplace where school has a lot of outside spaces where you walk between classes, or are you someplace where school is entirely in the building with the exception of perhaps recess or PE? Seating, where are you seated in the classroom? Movement, how much movement is required to get in between classes? Eating, sometimes eating can be a challenge, especially if there are food sensitivities. The social aspect can always be a challenge. And then materials needed, the heavy backpack, and making sure that you're organized to go home. And so one of the things that I recommend is that you go in and you observe. And observing at school, you may not be able to go in for a full school day, but you can observe little snippets of the school day, and you can talk to your child about kind of what's going on. This would also be true if you're trying to access a soccer team or a music class. Go and observe. and see what is going on and what pieces of that are really hard and challenging for your child. And it's going to be different for everyone. So as you go through that, you can say, what symptoms, in terms of the JM or in terms of the medications my child takes, what symptoms are impacting these things? An example I gave was the methotrexate and the start time at school. So in this situation, if you take your methotrexate, let's say on a Thursday night, and now it's Friday morning, and you have to be on that school bus that's coming to pick you up at 6:42 a.m. if you're in middle school, you may not be feeling it at that point in time. You may just not be feeling well. So the next question is, how important is it that you access that activity? If it's school, it's pretty much required. So you might need to think about a way to access this, or you just plan to go in late that day. So you have options. And I really think this is a really big, important thing in terms of accessing your life and your community and school. And this question really is important, and is, does this bring my child joy? How do I make sure that my child, when they're accessing school or accessing a community activity, how do I make sure that it is a positive in their lives? So, for example, perhaps on Friday morning, my child could start school late. And if he's taking a class that he's really good at and it's not a problem for him to be late on Friday morning, then that's probably a good path to go. But if he has his book class, the one that makes him want to go to school, if that is like a technical education class or we love math, or a choir class, then my kid's really going to want to be there. He's going to want to make sure that he gets there. You can also consider moving your methotrexate day. But again, you're always, anytime you start to move things around, you have to go back and reevaluate, what are we potentially missing? Okay, so far, the information that you want to have in your head as you start to work on trying to access community in school is, you need to learn about JM. You need to figure out which symptoms is your child experiencing, and you need to identify where your child's symptoms are preventing access to school and community. So there's lots of ways to do this, and I just threw out a few here. This is a little bit to do with school, but this is really pertains to everything. So if you are in a music class of some sort and you want to contact that teacher and say, my child is taking a lot of prednisone right now, and my child is a little bit cranky here and there, and I apologize in advance, and my child apologizes in advance, but as much as you can do to help him or her feel safe in here would be really greatly appreciated. So to send that email, often to write a letter to fellow parents. My son was in a class for a couple of years where we had a little parent email group going around. And whenever somebody had strep throat or had the flu or was concerned about something, we all knew about it. We all knew, and a few of us would go, oh, it's time to run out and go get a strep test. So that was actually really helpful. So sometimes doing a community group like that can be great. You might just want to write a letter to fellow parents. You can share that document, what is JM, with coaches, teachers. That's very, very helpful. Another idea is to work on a presentation for classmates or teammates so that they can see kind of what JM is and what you're going through. And I think it's really critical that when you go down this path that you really always include what a fighter and how amazing your child is in terms of battling this illness. Always, you should consider meeting with the teacher. And I highly recommend being gracious yet tenacious. Don't go on the attack. Sometimes you're going to get sloughed off and you're going to be irritated, but take a deep breath, wait a day, go back and keep trying to work it. And then we're going to move into some of the more formal help that you can receive, your child can receive at school. So we're going to start taking action. And one of the last pieces we need before we actually in order to have all the pieces together when we go to the school is to get a letter from our physician. And basically, I'll just quick read through this, but basically this is just a model of a letter that you could have a physician write. I recommend, though, that all those things that we did at first where we listed the symptoms and the medication side effects that affect our children, and then where life is difficult at school, so like getting to school on time, walking between classes, am I super light sensitive, am I having trouble with the lights in the classroom, is my backpack too heavy, am I really tired and fatigued and just can't pay attention long enough and I need to have breaks when I'm taking a test. All of that stuff you need to have thought through ahead of time so that you can provide that to your physician so that they can consider including it in the letter, because everything that the physician puts in the letter makes your life much easier once you start going down the path for getting help at school. So basically this letter here is just basically the student is a 8-year-old who has been under my care. The student has been diagnosed with juvenile dermatomyositis and is being treated and is being seen frequently by me. The symptoms include muscle weakness, pain, rash, all of which the student is experiencing. These symptoms can be disabling. In addition, due to risk of a flare or worsening of disease, the student must wear sunscreen when outdoors at all times and cannot be outside for more than a certain number of minutes when it's sunny. At this time, the student is prescribed these medications. The medication side effects include the following. As a result of all these symptoms and medication side effects, it is my medical opinion that the student will require the following supports in the school setting in order to access the general education curriculum. And then at the bottom would be just a list of services or accommodations that the physician would think would be appropriate. For example, a shortened day, partial home-based services, a reduced workload, access to shade. And that list can really just go on and on. And then I think Sue's going to come in.
The only thing on your letter is the physician cannot request or cannot write the prescription for an IEP. They can say the child may require special education services, etc., but a prescription for an IEP or a prescription for a 504 plan will not get those things. So just keep that in mind when you're doing your letter. The next slide is the different options that you've got for plans in school. A health plan, a non-binding agreement. The non-binding agreement I'll let Michelle speak to because we don't have that in the state of California, which is where I'm from. A 504 plan and an IEP. A health plan is a non-legal binding agreement. It is primarily done with the school nurse. It can be done with the district nurse, the classroom teacher, and you as the parent. And it is the accommodations that your child needs for sunscreen protection, for coming to the nurse's office to rest, for being able to be inside during recess. Those can all go on a health plan. Keep in mind health plan, the keyword health, and that's what we're looking at. It is not putting anything in typically for the classroom unless it's to have sunscreen on all the time because of UV lights. Michelle, do you want to cover the non-binding agreement?
Sure. A non-binding agreement is essentially going to be the same as a 504 or an IEP. The difference here is that it is non-binding. It is usually preliminary and something that your school system may put into place if you're in crisis or if they're trying to kind of figure out what's going on, or if you need assistance before you can go through the entire process of getting a 504 or especially an IEP in place.
Okay. A 504 plan, and our children with JM qualify for all of these things. It depends on what they need in the school environment to be successful. A 504 plan is a legally binding agreement. It is reviewed a minimum of once a year with the classroom teacher, the 504 coordinator, who can be the school psychologist, it can be a counselor, it can be the principal. It's a variety of people that can take that role as the 504 plan coordinator. It's the classroom teacher and you as the parent. It's accommodations that are put into writing. They're put into place for your child to be successful in the general education setting. It is no special education classes. It is no special education services. It is just the accommodations. The plans will look different for an elementary school child versus a middle school child, where a middle school child may need the set of books at home, may need the elevator key, may need to have the backpack with wheels, may need a locker on every floor so that they can access things. All of those accommodations, it can be shortened tests. Depending on your school district and sometimes depending on your state, a 504 plan can help cover your absences and not require you to bring in medical proof as to why the child was absent, basically excusing them. Depends on the state, depends on the school district on that. An IEP has got interventions, which interventions are goals, meaning that your child requires something outside of the general education class for them to be academically successful. Do they need help in reading? Do they need help in writing? Do they need help in math? All of those would require for your child on standardized tests that are done for assessment to be scoring outside of the average range. For an IEP, you have to establish disability, which we have with our JM kids, and they qualify as OHI, other health impaired. But then you have to establish that there's a discrepancy. And it's not just based on a classroom test. It's got to be a standardized test that also shows that the child is below where they should be in any academic area. In the state of California, here we go again, where things can be different by the state. In the state of California, you cannot qualify for occupational therapy services as a standalone service, meaning fine motor skills. Are their muscles weak enough that they can't hold the pencil and write? If that's the only thing they need, it's not going to go on an IEP. And they can't qualify for services that way in the state of California. It could include PT for gross motor, gross movement. In some districts, you will either have an occupational therapist or a physical therapist. It is rare that districts have both, and if you've got that in your district, you're extremely lucky, because budget funding typically doesn't allow for both, even though a child may need both. The PT piece can overflow to the OT person, or vice versa if they only have one person of that ability on campus or in your district. It can also be speech services. It can also include, in that speech and language, swallowing. It can include voice therapy. All of those things as part of speech and language, as well as academic services. So your interventions are your IEP goals that are written for what the child needs. Next slide, Michelle. Okay, here's a basic description between an IEP and a 504 plan. Okay, blueprint for your IEP is their special education services. While in present levels on an IEP, it will include what they're doing in the regular education classroom. What is primarily included on the IEP is the areas that the child needs assistance in. If a child is doing fabulous in math and doesn't need any assistance, then that is not going to be included, except to say they are at grade level in the general education math classroom. Excuse me. What it does, an IEP provides individualized special education and related services. It doesn't mean that the services are one-on-one. The services are typically in a small group with other children, not necessarily from your child's class, but students who are at the same level, whether it's at they're in the same grade level or not. I know as a resource specialist, I group my kids, all have a group that has a second, third, and fourth grader in it because they're all at that same academic level. It can also mean that the child's getting either what we call push-in services or pull-out services. Push-in means that we're providing that service in the regular education classroom, but with a special education trained teacher in the classroom. Or it can be pull-out, meaning they're pulled into a small group in another classroom. Neither of a 504 plan or an IEP is at any cost. The entire thing is free from the beginning of assessment, any tests, any specialists that are involved. It is paid for by the district. Now, if you're asking for a specialist to do assessment and the school district agrees with that, then you may have to do a private assessment and with any luck, have the school district pay for it. But typically, whoever your child needs in a school setting, that person they have access to for assessment. The Americans, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, is what applies to an IEP, and the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 is what covers 504 plans. Both are federal laws that are put into place to stop discrimination against children with disabilities or to provide what we can for children with disabilities. Next. Health plan. Easiest plan to put into place. You request a meeting with the school nurse. If you don't have a school nurse, you're requesting it with the school district nurse. You can send that request via email or in writing. They will respond to both. Request a physician letter to take because it's got all the information and it pretty much explains everything that you need to have for the school. You'll then meet with the nurse. Sometimes the classroom teacher should be included, especially if there's things that the child has to go to the office before recess to get sunscreen, if the child's staying inside during recess, so your regular education teacher would be involved, and you. Health plans are typically also reviewed yearly. They are not a legally binding documents, so they have the most wiggle room for school district people not to comply with. It's the least recommended, in my opinion, of all plans for our kids. Next, 504 plan. A little bit harder to come by, but easy in my opinion compared to an IEP. Child must have a disability. You're going to have your doctor's letter with you also for this to prove that there is a disability. The school coordinator is, like I said, it's either the principal, counselor, school psychologist. Every school has a coordinator, but they may have somebody from the district come sit in on the meeting also. Don't be concerned if that happens. You can call the school or call the district special education department in there under Ed Services to find out who your coordinator is. Then request a formal request for the 504 plan meeting, 504 plan to be put into place and why you are asking for it. I totally recommend that you do this in writing versus an email. And when you do it in writing, I recommend you hand deliver it to somebody and have it date stamped, because then you can't get, oh, I didn't get it. Oh, I didn't get that email. Oh, that email went to the wrong person. By having it delivered in person and date stamped, that you've got proof that it's been there. Then you follow up with your request. If you don't hear from a few days, call or send a polite email. Best thing not to ruffle somebody's feathers right off the bat, because these are the people that you're going to be working with substantially for years for your child's needs. When you get to the 504 plan, everybody has a chance to give input. The teacher will start with their input and start with what they have observed of your child in class. Parent, you give input to, give your physician letter, and always provide What is JM from the Cure JM website. I also recommend that you give your physician letter and provide What is JM to your child's teacher, preferably at the beginning of the school year. You can provide it at any point, but it would be a good idea for them to have that for a week or two before your requested 504 plan meeting, so that they can look at your child with a little bit of an extra special eye to see the concerns that they have in the classroom. Our kids qualify because, again, they have a disability, but be prepared to advocate because you are the one that knows what your child needs best. If it is bringing in examples of things that have come home from school, or citing conversations that you have had with the classroom teacher, whatever it is, have that with you, and make sure, as it says in the middle section here, think about your child's day. What is hard due to the issue that they have JM? All of the different things that have been mentioned before. Collaborate to create your 504 plan. There again, it's pretty much everything that we've talked about so far, and making sure you've covered all the areas that are weakness for your child. And remember, this is just accommodations and modifications to the general education plan. This is not any extra or special services for the 504 plan. Okay, attached here is a page of sample modifications. Can be done at the time of the 504 plan. Your 504 plan is legally for one year from the date you've done it. It's not from the beginning of a school year to the end of a school year. It's from when you do it to 1 calendar year later. If something changes partway through the year, you get together, you hold another meeting and add in other accommodations that you need for your child, especially if they've gone from at the end of one school year, they finished elementary school, the beginning of fall, they've started middle school. I would recommend getting together promptly at the beginning of the school year to see what accommodations need to be changed or what needs to be put in place for your child now that they're at middle school. The other thing that I recommend is that, especially if your child is in middle school or high school, be proactive and make sure that once the 504 plan is in place, that every teacher has a copy of it. At middle school, it's preferable that all of the teachers attend the 504 plan meeting. It doesn't necessarily happen because they're not always all available. So making sure every teacher has it. From one school year to the next, even if it's elementary school to elementary school, you make sure that the new teacher has a copy of the 504 plan in place and that they know what the document looks like before the school year even starts. All sorts of things on the accommodation page that's listed. There is also on the CureJM website from the Chicago conference was added on other accommodations that are entirely possible. Several pages of them, and also a couple of governmental websites that you can look at. So I also recommend that you go to the CureJM website and look at what's there to add. Next. Okay. Does your child have one or more of the 13 conditions that are covered under the special education law? Absolutely, positively, 100%. Our children qualify as other health impaired. Does your child need both services and accommodations to succeed in school? 504 plan provides your accommodations. Your IEP provides your accommodations, modifications, and services that are specially designed specifically for your child to be successful. Those are the differences. If your child also has a learning disability, your eligibility criteria can be twofold. The primary disability, which you would decide with your IEP team, is it the learning disability? That's primary, and that's I would totally recommend. And then secondary can be the OHI or JM. So if there's any other disability, it also makes sure that it gets on your IEP, not just the JM. Because if your child goes into remission or your child no longer needs special education services because of their JM, well, they may need it because of their learning disability, because of their autism, because of their speech and language impairment. So make sure both of those eligibility criteria are in your IEP. Next, starting the IEP process. Write a formal letter requesting that your child be evaluated for special education services. Be specific in that letter as to why you're requesting it. Find out where to send your request. It says on here via paper copy or email. Again, I suggest paper copy. I suggest that it is hand delivered to somebody and date stamped, and that you at the same time have a copy of that with the date stamp on it. Once your request has been made, your follow-up typically is going to come in within legally 15 days of the district to say to you, here's an assessment plan, we're going to move forward with assessment, or to offer you what they call a student study team to gather information before you're given the assessment plan. Initial IEP meeting, student study team. Student study team is typically held before you've done your assessment, with the initial IEP meeting at the end of your assessment. Your assessment, from the time you have signed the assessment plan, the school district has 60 calendar days to complete the assessment. That includes vacations that are 5 days or under. If a vacation is 2 weeks, as in Christmas break, the calendar stops at the break and then restarts after the break. If it's a 5-day break, say at Thanksgiving, the calendar keeps ticking. So you will have your IEP within 60 days of signing the assessment plan for that. Excuse me. Everything on here is super important, and of course the magic words, accessing education. Relate symptoms and side effects of how they prevent your child from accessing his or her education. Very important in getting the services and the goals that you need on the IEP. IEP eligibility. Here's where I said after 60 days, you have your initial IEP team meeting. You have the opportunity to provide updates and additional information or documentation that you have, and the team will discuss the eligibility. They must have a disability. Yes, they do. And that the JM is preventing them from accessing their education, that they cannot be successful without specially designed instruction at their level or in the areas that they need to be successful. At that time, go ahead, change the page. The IEP will include present levels of academic achievement or functional performance in all areas: reading, writing, math, fine motor, gross motor, speech and language. Whatever you have assigned on your assessment plan will be covered in the assessment. If your assessment plan did not check the box for speech and language, there will be no speech and language assessment. So when you are given that assessment plan, make sure that all of the boxes that you want addressed have been checked in the assessment plan. All of those professionals, occupational therapists, in my case, the resource specialist who's done the academic testing, the school psychologist, the speech and language therapist, the general education teacher must also attend, and school psychologist, and typically the school principal will attend. All of the strengths and weaknesses, there will be at least a statement listed in each one of those areas. And as it says here, if a category has a weakness, it must also have a strength. There's also a box for parent input. I know on our California IEPs, it asks the parent, what are your child's strengths? Doesn't have to be school, can be home. Ours says strengths, interests, and activities. So you're including the child's whole life. What are the things that they like to do? What are the things they are good at? And then the second area on our IEPs is parents' concerns relevant to their education. And there's where you've got a chance to state their JM is impacting their ability to be successful in school. It says weaknesses noted are then used as a basis to develop IEP goals. IEP goals are closely monitored and is the framework for determining special interventions your child will receive in order to meet the goals. If I write a goal for reading, then I have to provide a service to go along with reading. My goals are updated. Our school district operates on semesters, so our goals are updated semesterly. School districts that are trimester, the IEP goal dates, updates go home trimester. I'm a little different too in that I provide a monthly newsletter to my parents with just a note of what that child is doing, all relevant towards their IEP goals. Also in your IEP, there is a page for accommodations to their program, modifications, and this is pretty much all of those accommodations that would go on a 504 plan are listed here. And then other accommodations, you've also got modifications. Are we modifying the school day? Are they only coming to school half a day? Are we giving them a one-on-one instructional assistance? Are we saying they're not going to go to PE, or they're only going to go to PE when they're feeling well? Those are modifications to their program, and those are all included in the IEP. Next. Thank you very much. And I think Michelle might have something to add to this back on some of those slides. Michelle?
The only thing I would add is that in Virginia, at least, and I believe in several more states, you don't have to have a learning disability to have an IEP. It can, to go along with your JM, it doesn't have to be academic. It can also be social, emotional.
It can be here too. It's just harder on the qualification.
Yeah, thank you. So for accommodations related to sun protection, could a child qualify for a 504? So things like the specific amount of time they can spend in the sun at recess, or maybe like no going outside for PE, or if it's like above a certain temperature, having them, indoor instead of outside for recess. Would that qualify as an accommodation for a 504, or would that really fall under a health plan?
Yes, you could use that to qualify for a 504, just because it is legally binding and you need to ensure that your child would be safe. You can try and work that without having a formal plan, and a school may or may not follow through on that. But I always recommend that you go ahead and go with the informal plan that they're offering you, and if it works out what they're doing, then you ask to formalize it into a 504.